lot of times parents are seeing their kids' behaviors and not looking at them through a trauma loss lens. And so they're looking at them more through a personal lens. But many times in a young child's mind, the narrative is wrapped in rejection and abandonment. Because I remember being 6 and not understanding life circumstances for my birth mother. I didn't understand why she was able to have more kids and keep them, and why that couldn't be my story.
Well, hi, Isaac. It's so good to see you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely honored to be here.
Yeah, so Isaac and I met ever so briefly at a conference last fall, and he was one of the keynote speakers. And the whole time I'm sitting there, I'm like, dude, we got to get this guy on the podcast. I would love to hear more about what you do, and I'd love for your wisdom to pour out into our audience. And so I'm just excited to have you.
Thank you. Happy to be here, and happy we crossed paths at the conference. It was a great time, and I feel like we definitely had too brief of an interaction, and so it's going to be great to, chat more here.
Oh, fun. Yeah. And as I was saying before we hit record, like I truly don't know you as well. And so this is like a fresh, raw kind of like, let's get to know each other. But I do know enough to know that like, I'm so glad you're here, and your wisdom and like what you have to offer our audience and the folks that are, quote, as we say, on the trail with us.
Yeah.
Man, it's just absolutely in line with everything that we're trying to do. So
Amazing. Thank you.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to start off with some word association.
Okay.
So I'm going to say a word, and you can say like the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
All right. There's no judgment here. And this is just meant to be fun. So
Let's do
are
it.
you ready?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. First word, hamburger.
Craving. I've been thinking about hamburger for 2 days.
Oh, gosh, I love that. I mean, I hate that you're craving it. Sounds like something that needs to be solved, right?
It will get solved this week, probably.
There you go. Okay, kite.
Fly.
Fly.
Yeah.
Swagger.
Gosh, I don't even know what. I guess like a way a person walks is kind of what came with my association. Like
Okay, so a walk. Yeah. Okay. Replanted.
Reborn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Music.
Soul giving.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah.
And the last word, depth.
Part of all of us.
Ooh, good.
Depth.
Fun, fun, fun. Oh gosh, that's fun. Thank you. Okay, so tell us your organization, your role in the organization, how it got started.
Yeah. So I own multiple organizations now, but the main work that I do is all in adoption. And so I started a company 4 years ago called Identity, which then grew into Parenting Different. And so what we do at Parenting Different is we provide resources, content, courses, and regular support to adoptive parents primarily, with definitely foster parents that are benefiting a lot from the work that we do. But I would say like our main target audience is adoptive parents, because that's, I think, the audience that we know best, we connect with most, and obviously it's my experience as an adoptee, and it's where I find the most passion and where we can make the most impact. And so we put out a weekly newsletter, weekly resources. We do quite a few regular webinars. And the goal is just helping parents be better equipped to parent adoptees well. A big passion of mine, and I think it's been true throughout all the work that I've done, from transracial adoption to now being more kind of like oversight and managerial, has always been to create a better experience for adoptees. And so my goal is that adoptees going into adoptive homes have better experiences, have more honest experiences. And to me, I think that creates a better outcome for adoptees as a whole. Right now, we kind of live in like a very kind of social media time where I think we see a lot of conflicting opinions about adoption and adoptees and their experience. And I think that one of the reasons we see such a conflict in how adoptees talk about their experiences is that some adoptees grew up in homes that recognize loss, grief, and trauma, and some grew up in homes that didn't. And I think when we see people who express a lot of frustration with adoption, we are seeing an outcome of homes that did not understand trauma, loss, and grief. And my goal is that adoptees go into homes that understand loss, grief, and trauma, and how to support their child throughout their childhood and into adulthood, so that ideally adoptees have better outcomes, which is, I believe, making a better experience for adoptees.
Oh my goodness, so cool. Well, the origins of James Trail really started in the foster adopt community as well, because we have 5 kids, 4 of which are adopted, and we have an interracial, transracial family as well. So we're involved in some of these conferences where, I met you, and now James Trail, we've moved out of, just adoption and foster communities, but really anyone has been impacted by trauma. But I love so much of what you said about we need to understand grief and loss and trauma. And without that understanding and without that depth, talking about depth again, without
Yeah.
that depth of understanding, right? Then man, it impacts our parenting. It impacts our relationships with our kids.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I spent a ton of time with adoptees, and especially over the last couple of years, I've been grateful to spend a lot more time in adoptee communities. And I mean, the themes are very consistent with the adoptees that do not have relationships with their parents anymore, that have more frustrations with the system, and there are valid critiques of our child welfare system. So I'm not dismissing those, but I think that the core themes that I find are a lot of hurt, and that hurt is rooted in usually a misunderstanding of the child as a person. And um, I always like to say that grief has an expression. So if loss is inherently connected to adoption through separation, then there's going to also be inherently grief, and grief is always going to have a behavior attached to it. And I think a lot of times parents are seeing their kids' behaviors and not looking at them through a trauma loss lens. And so they're looking at them more through a personal lens, which means that, like, when your kid's misbehaving and having issues at school and all these things, you're doing maybe a very stereotypical parent thing, which is like, I'm being embarrassed at school, I'm parenting wrong, I'm failing as a parent. And when we reframe our thinking about these things, we see how these things might be connected to a grief and a trauma they've experienced. And then we can ask our children, I think, different questions, support them in different ways, understand the behavior differently. And I like to also add that on the flip side, we also see kids that are over perfectionist. They're doing everything perfectly, have an inability to fail. And that is also an expression. And so, being able to be very conscious as parents that our children have a loss connected to their story, will have grief displayed somehow in childhood, teenage years, adulthood, and can we be conscious enough of their behavior, even if their behavior is the perfectionist side, which we like, right? We like our kids, the A-roll student. We like that they're the perfect kid. But can we be conscious of how the inner narratives inside many adoptees are actually not setting them up for success in the long term?
Yeah, like performance based, like I have to do this well.
Yeah, of
Like the parents, of course, are saying, we love you no matter what grades you
course.
get.
Yeah,
But somewhere buried, perhaps inside that adoptee is saying, yeah, but
right. Yeah,
yeah,
well,
say more about that.
abandonment is such an interesting undertone of how an adoptee views the lens of their life most of the time.
Mm,
So even if that's not true, right? So I want to frame that too. Abandonment is not always the honest scenario, right? Not all kids were left at a doorstep and their parents ran away,
sure.
right? Some parents tried to parent for a little bit. Some parents lost parental rights, and are some birth parents are very involved and are adopting because that are placing their child for adoption because that's what they needed to do, but they still want to get updates and all those kinds of things, right? So there's many actual realities around adoption, but many times in a young child's mind, the narrative is wrapped in rejection and abandonment. Because I remember being 6 and not understanding life circumstances for my birth mother. I didn't understand why she was able to have more kids and keep them, and why that couldn't be my story, right? So my narrative around my story was wrapped in abandonment and rejection. And so my behavior as a child who can't process those things naturally had those undertones. And so I think that if abandonment and rejection, which we know is very, very common for adoptees as an undertone, is there, then we might see that an adoptee overperforms perfectionist to avoid rejection, or does not perform at all, misbehaves, does things to avoid failing to meet the perfectionism state. So I would rather just be bad because I already feel abandoned rejection rather than try to fit this, right? And so instead of being more equal, which is what we want for our children and for people in general, to say, hey, there's going to be some things I do really well, and there's going to be some things I don't do as well. And I can live in the in between of these things, which is kind of more of a healthy inner dialogue around things. I think it's just, at least from what I see, and it's not, again, these things are not universal because there's always going to be fringe cases and all these things. But what I tend to see from a lot of adoptees, especially talking with them as adults about their childhood, is that they fell on either side of them. And to be honest, I fell on the like not performing for not performing so that I fail side. Like I was a bad student, I was disruptive, but I had my own passions and interests that I was hyper fixated on. Um, while my younger siblings were very academic, very good, and there was tension there. And so I don't want people to think that I was on the perfectionist side, or that that's a better side. I actually think it's they both have equal harm. And for children who grow into adults, which is where I tend to get a lot of like sensitivity and like heart, is that I think that we don't understand how hard adoptees transitioning to adulthood becomes because of these things. And the adulthood journey, I actually think, tends to be much harder for adoptees to understand all of this stuff that's happening or has happened.
Well, yeah, and your prefrontal cortex is
Yeah,
growing and
100%.
learning all the way to what we're 25 or something. I mean, my goodness. And the crazy part is that both the misbehaving or whatever side and the perfectionist side, like both sides, it's not conscious,
Yeah, it's not.
right?
Yeah,
Nobody's saying like, I'm gonna be a perfectionist because I fear that, like it
right.
just kind of
Yeah,
evolves or happens, or whatever their DNA or just like their tendency, your personality tendencies. And it's what I'm hearing you say is like, of course what we're going for is more balance in the middle, where you know a concept that I find really helpful is that two things can be true at the same time,
it's not.
right?
Yeah,
Yes, I was adopted because my birth family situation was not ideal
mm,
because of XYZ.
right.
Yes, that is true. But also, I am loved and seen and cared for imperfectly, but still yet cared for by these people in my life, be it, adoptive parents, foster parents, kinship, whatever. And the two things can be true at the same time. And
Yeah,
that's tough.
and that's a really yeah, it's a really hard, I think, for children. And you know, some of what actually gives me, I think, a lot of fire underneath a lot of this work is that I think that what I would love to see happen, or would love to see more examples of, is adopted young adults who are very aware of how trauma has impacted them and their inner dialogues going into adulthood. And I think that's a really interesting possibility in this time where trauma knowledge is much more available, and much more open dialogues. TBRI is much more kind of, we all love TBRI, we all talk, what I mean? We all do this whole thing. And I would love to see, young adult adoptees who are conscious of these things. And that's hard. 18 was not my most conscious time. It's not anybody's most conscious time. But I do think that there is a lot of hurt that has happened as a byproduct of me not understanding how deep some of these inner dialogues went. And I would love to see other young people avoid those things as much as possible. And same thing for many of my friends who have spent their early 20s causing harm and hurt unintentionally because we didn't understand that our rejection and abandonment wounds would make us push everybody away, hurt people that we loved, and do all these things. And so I just think there's a really interesting opportunity for parents to not only be models of unconditional love and understanding and all these things, but also be people who are walking with their children as they ultimately are growing into adults who have to navigate that on their own. And that's an important next step that can only occur once parents actually understand and embody it in their parenting. That next step can't happen until first that's how we're parenting in the home. You can't sit down your 18-year-old and be like, well, just so you know, you've had abandonment issues this whole time that we never talked about and rejection.
Right.
I know we've never talked about your adoption, but it's going to affect all your
By
relationships.
the way, you were adopted or whatever. Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't work like that, right? And so if you
Right.
become parents that model healthy relationships, the conversation can at least happen, I think, a little bit more naturally
Sure.
as a young adoptee is going out to form their own relationships
Right.
and things.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned that I want to clarify for our audience, you brought up TBRI. TBRI is trust-based relational intervention, and it's a modality of training. I'm also a TBRI practitioner, and it's a great way. It's a great training and understanding of coming alongside kids who've experienced hard parts of their stories. So anyway, just wanted to reference that for our audience. But let's talk about story. Let's talk about adoptees and foster kids and kinship placement, like the story behind what happened before, kind of thing, and the importance of understanding that. Because I think, as an adoptive parent, if I tell the full story,
Mm,
number one, I don't want my kid to be sad. And
yeah.
so I might hold back. I might want to like not tell them the full story. But actually, that can cause its own form of damage by not really being honest with all the things and just sitting with the kid in the hard spaces. So, can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think that kind of the first thing that we have to remember is that it is our child's story kind of first, right? And so there is, I think, actually a lot of validity in what you're saying to where I might not want to tell my child the full story because it might hurt their feelings, it might make them upset, all these things. So I think that's actually a good frame to hold because while I do think that it is the child's story and they should know it, I think that by understanding a child's story and by understanding how it might affect them, we can be conscious of how we share their story with them and when we share their story with them. So, so I think, yeah, I talk to a lot of people who are basically like, when should I tell them their story? It's going to be hard, all these things. And it's like, I don't necessarily know that it's like a when do I tell them their story. I think that you can find little ways to share their story with them throughout their life and in age appropriate and in very um, like they get autonomy back. So if your child has a really hard story, maybe share like a small part of the story and ask them if they are interested in knowing more. So say, hey, just so you know, your mom was in and out of jail before you were born. I know that might be tough, and if you want more details, I'm happy to talk. Or if that feels like enough for right now, or if that feels too hard, we don't have to talk about it anymore until you're ready. But instead of saying, your mom was in jail for X, Y, and Z, and she did all these things, and all, you're dumping onto your child at like
And they're 6 years
yeah,
old or whatever. Yeah.
6 years old, or they're 18 years old. Like, if
Right.
I mean,
Right.
we're thinking consciously that we already know, and you should already know that your child is thinking about their birth family to some degree. They're thinking about their history. They're thinking about how they ended up in this world. And so they're already curious to some degree about these people, whether you have any contact or minimal contact or anything. They're already curious. So, how can you be a part of that curiosity instead of that curiosity being something that they are doing on their own? When I talk about loss and grief, I actually add guilt in there. So I say loss, grief, and guilt because I think that most adoptees experience all three. What they experience is the loss, they experience grief, and they experience guilt around having that grief. And so, and that is, I think, mainly due to the fact that, at least historically, and how we've talked about adoption maybe 10, 20 years ago, was not to talk about adoption. And so, a lot of kids that I know, grew up in homes where, like, we talked about adoption on adoption day and we celebrated adoption, but we never mentioned your birth parents. Like, we never talked about the hard parts. We never made space for complexity. And so, because children are going to experience those things and teenagers are going to experience those things either way, oftentimes they start to develop guilt around their curiosity, guilt around the fact that, like, why am I not like celebrating my adoption like everybody else? Like, why when we celebrate my adoption day, I'm thinking about my birth mother, and this underlying of guilt occurs in many adoptees. It's the guilt theme is so common among almost every adult adoptee that I've talked to that it's one of the reasons why I've added it there. Is it's such a recurring theme, and I will say that it's also a theme in some homes where it is open because in a sense, our narratives around adoption are always that it's like the most loving thing that can happen. So sometimes adoptees, even if you're making openness forward to talk about it, like they still feel guilty for not being like the traditional Hallmark movie. To tell a story about this, because I think it might be interesting, I remember that, gosh, I was probably, I don't know, 20, I was probably like 21, 22, and I was just really struggling with my adoption. I don't know, like, I think adoption seasons and waves and all those things, and I was really struggling. I remember I went over to my parents' house, and I think I was just visibly upset. And my mom asked, and I remember I said to her, to be honest, like it's just, in my head, like it's just been looping. Like I can't believe she left me at the adoption agency that day because I was 2 years old. I'd already been living with her. I was like, for some reason, just like I can't believe she left me there, just looping. I was getting upset, crying, and all these things. And I remember the first thing I did as soon as I started crying was apologize to my mom. I was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm so sorry I'm bringing this up. And she was like, you don't ever have to apologize for me. These are normal feelings. But the instinct, I think, for many adoptees is guilt and shame around their heavy emotions towards their birth family. Because they don't want to hurt you as their parents. They love you, but it exists as a theme. And yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it felt relevant.
Oh, that's so important to hear, and to hear from, by your self-report, the not the perfectionist kid, but the kid
Yeah.
that got into some trouble, that like there's still that
Oh,
like
yeah,
instinctual feeling of like, oh, I just want to make sure like
100%.
my mom isn't offended by this, and
Yeah.
I'm just so glad that your mom like got that. What'd you say?
Yeah. I said, your child might be acting out because of their guilt. You know what I mean?
Right, right. I mean, absolutely. But the fact that your mom could like hear you in that space and like give you like all the room and space to like express that and move forward in it, that's beautiful.
Yeah, my parents
No,
have
that's
been good about that. My parents have been really good. I mean, especially in my adult years, because it's just come back up in a different way. In adulthood and becoming a parent can be a really hard experience for adoptees, and it was really hard for me. Um, and so my parents have been really great about, keeping this doorway open, conversations, and figuring out, my emotional landscape as I've worked through my inner mommy issues, the core mommy issues we as adoptees tend to have.
well, and you know what's so important about that as an adoptive parent is that like I have to work through my crap. Like I got to deal with my crap in order to make space for whatever's happening in my house. And if I don't do that, then the response that I'm likely going to make to my kid in that moment is not ideal.
Right. Yeah. And even more so in this is just maybe an adulthood reflection, so maybe not as accurate, but I do think that there has been a gift for me in my mom does speaking, and she does her own. We do a workshop together, so like this is not sharing her story. She shares this very publicly, but my mom suffered for 8 years of infertility and miscarriages and things like that, and being able to understand her story and her pain was actually really helpful to me in my adulthood. And so I think that is how to manage your stuff so that it doesn't affect your child, and that you can obviously do the parenting lens that you need to, um, while understanding that like you're still a human, you're still somebody who's experienced your own trauma and things. And I think that there's a gift on the other side of this journey, that as your children learn more about your story, there becomes this like two-way grace. And I think that my I've really found that in my family, but also my siblings who are biological, they still grew up in a house with multiple levels of trauma. My parents' infertility journey, me, there's three in the middle that are biological, and then there's another adopted kid at the end. And so there was a lot going on in that
There's
house.
a lot of flavor there.
There was a lot of trauma that had been there. There was a lot of I've been working on a book, and one of the lines that I wrote was that we didn't realize that we were surrounded by ghosts, the ghost of all the children
Mm.
that my parents lost,
Ooh.
and the ghost of my birth parents. And
Wow.
I think in adoptive home, there's a lot of ghosts around. There's a lot of people that are actually there but not there. And
Right.
um, so my siblings have also, who are biological, have also had to have their own healing and understanding and grace for me, my brother, and my parents. And so I think on the other side of a lot of this, something that parents can always look forward to is that if you create this home of honesty and transparency and support for these things, your kids will also one day give it back to you. And that's been a
Right.
really beautiful part of the adult relationships that I've been able to have with my parents, but also my siblings have been able to have with them.
And that's a beautiful expression of empathy that, like, in your adulthood, as she's not putting the burden on you like you're her therapist, but just in the correct, boundaries kind of way.
Yeah,
She's sharing like the challenges of her life, and then it gives you opportunity to express empathy towards her. And then, I mean, this is the relationship,
it's
right?
a
This is the
relationship.
beauty of things going back and forth.
Yeah. And parenthood is a relationship. I have a 5-year-old, so like I'm in the part of it to where like I'm sure my son can't imagine that I have a hard time. I can't imagine that I'm struggling with deep things, right? But at 25, he probably will have an understanding that like I was 25 and I struggled with things and I have hurt. And kind of I think a blessing of that perspective for me is like being able to parent with a little bit more like grace under in that seeing it in my family has me understanding that like yeah, I definitely need to have my things together and make sure that I can not parent from a reactive place. But one day all the mistakes that I do make, inevitably make, having, will be more understandable because one day he'll get to see me as a person because that's truly what I am. And I think that adoptive families that thrive in the adulthood season, they get to a point of seeing each other as humans, and at some point, parents have to be human.
Right. And sometimes that challenge can be for the kid, or at least this is what some of my kids have expressed, that like, oh, you're not perfect.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh, you actually struggle. Oh, and I'm like, y'all, I never said that I was, you know what I mean? But like the kind of parenting that we try to bring for our kiddos, especially those, come from hard places,
100%.
we try to provide sort of perfect parenting, which is not existent. But anyway,
Course.
so that journey for everybody is so good, especially when there's like openness, empathy, and everyone's dealing with their stuff, which I'm a huge advocate for therapy, counseling, community. Faith is a huge part of my journey too. So, all of those things, so
Yeah.
necessary.
And if you think about some of these tenets of trauma informed parenting, which is kind of understanding for punishment, right, and repair, like some of these
Yeah,
themes, if your kids are being raised this way, they become people that also like that's their understanding of
right.
we. Oh, when people explode, we don't yell back at them. We
Yeah.
pause and we try to understand what's underneath the reaction. And what a gift to the world that we have young people that are being raised like that. Not even for their own sake, but for the sake of the communities that they're a part of. Because we've all, I mean, I remember being in college and, people overreacting, and the instinct of young people is just to fight. But imagine, you have a young person who goes into the world, and when they hear people have big emotions, their reaction is not to fight them back or to make it worse, but their reaction is to, hey, there's a feeling underneath that.
Yeah.
And what a gift to communities I think that we'll see in the next couple of decades because of this kind of parenting.